Everybody, good evening. Welcome to the Grand Boulevard Coalition Show. My name is Cynthia Alcerez, and I'll be your host for today. And as a reminder, I am a case manager for the Healthy Living, our #1 goal program for Chicago Area Project. And we have a lot of events and we do a lot of outreach in our communities. So if you're ever interested in seeing us out on the streets or in any events in your area, we're usually on the South Side area. So if you want to look us up, we are Healthy Living CAP or CAP Healthy Living on our Facebook and our Instagram. So feel free to check us out and check us out, see if there's anything that you're interested in, any information, and any events we have coming up. So before we get into the show for today, the topic that I do want to talk about is going to be PTSD Awareness Month, since June is that month for awareness for PTSD. I thought it would be nice to talk about the interest, the awareness, just kind of giving out information on PTSD, what that looks like, symptoms, and according to DSM-5 criteria, we're going to get into all of that today. But before then, I did want to do a quick little announcement. Chicago Area Project is having a virtual webinar today. It'll be this evening. If you want to check Chicago Area Project on their Facebook page, they should have the information. I do not have the flyer for today, but if you look them up, you'll be able to find that information and register online and get that link to join their Zoom. For their Zoom today, the workshop is going to be focusing on red flags and safe space navigating consent and sexual assault awareness. So kind of talking a little bit about dating violence, teen dating violence. What are some of the signs that you can see in maybe a partner that might be potentially harmful towards you, whether that be physically, emotionally, or in other ways. So feel free to check that out. It's for youth, I believe, ages 13 to 18 or 13 to 24. So feel free to check that out if you're interested. That is tonight. So thank you very much to Chicago Area Project for doing these workshops, and we hope that you'll find them interesting. They do have upcoming workshops. If you missed the one today, that's totally fine. There's going to be more coming in the next month, so feel free to check them out and know about those. So getting into today's topic for PTSD, we're going to talk a little bit about why it's important to share this information, right? So even though PTSD is not a common condition, mental health condition, it is still something that happens to people in the U.S. and that people experience, obviously not just in the U.S., but for our show, that's the population we'll be talking about today. So it's not something that's common here, but it's still important to share because the community is so small of people that experience PTSD, we need to spread awareness. So that way, if we ever, encounter anyone with PTSD as professional, healthcare professionals, mental health professionals, or even if you're just a normal person, that doesn't work in the professional space, if you have a friend that might have PTSD, a family member that has PTSD, just kind of knowing the signs and the treatments and all that information is really good for all of us to know, right? And so I'll get a little bit into the information in terms of PTSD, what that is. I might have briefly mentioned it in previous shows before, PTSD. I know I mentioned C-PTSD, which we won't get too much into today, but that is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So our main focus today is PTSD. So kind of thinking a little bit about PTSD and how many Americans encounter or are diagnosed with PTSD. It is actually 1 in 100 Americans that currently or at any given time according to the one of the National Centers for PTSD website, they said that 1 in 100 Americans have PTSD in any given year, and there may be some that don't even know they have it or how to treat it, right? And so that 1 in 100 doesn't sound like a lot of people, right? But once you kind of add all those numbers up, it kind of goes into the millions, of people in the US that experience that. So, yeah, thinking a little bit more about PTSD in terms of the DSM-5, and I've talked about the DSM-5 before. DSM-5 is basically a professional tool used by mental health care professionals, therapists, psychiatrists, who are working with clients that might have any mental health conditions as well as behavioral conditions. They are all identified in the DSM-5 and they show the criteria. So this kind of helps these professionals with diagnosing their clients and patients with these conditions. So it's really a really helpful tool. It explains very thoroughly and in detail all the signs of somebody that might have PTSD, for example, right? Which is what we're going to be looking at specifically. So it's going to be very brief summarization of what's in the DSM-5, but some of those criteria include things like exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And this can be in a single event, so a one-time event that can cause this traumatic experience, or it can be multiple traumatic experiences, or consistent trauma, right? Especially, with children that might live in domestic violence situations who experience trauma on a regular basis, right? So even if it's not directly happening to you, it is still something that you experience, even if you're just witnessing it, right? So you can be the one experiencing the domestic violence, maybe between parents or family members. This could even, like I said, it can involve yourself. So if you're the one experiencing the domestic violence, things like that, these can cause trauma. And it does not mean that you automatically do have PTSD, because everybody handles trauma differently. It might affect somebody differently than it might affect you, right? So it's important to think about those factors. And this criteria kind of is looked at with children starting at 6 years old and up. So going into adulthood, all of these things can kind of be seen and observed by healthcare professionals. And yeah, so another criteria is reoccurring, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of these traumatic events. So that can be having the thoughts of whatever you experienced kind of replaying in your head throughout the day. Maybe something triggers it that gets you to think about it. Or it can be something that happens in your dreams. Something that you're going to sleep and you're dreaming about this traumatic event that happened to you, and it can wake you up, right? Because it's almost like a nightmare, but it's something that you experienced based on something that you experienced, right? And so this can affect your sleep schedule, can cause you to, not eventually lose sleep, have sleep apnea, things like that. Yeah, so an example that comes to mind when I think about PTSD and this criteria, specifically the dreams, is I had a client, obviously without getting too into specifics, a client that had come with their family from another country to flee a dangerous situation where his family was threatened. His children were threatened in front of him. The kids were traumatized by that event, right? The kids were very young. They were 7 years old and younger. And some of those kids, a couple of them, wake up from night terrors, from screaming in their sleep because they keep envisioning that traumatic event that happened to them. And so with that, I was able to give them the advice that I could give to recommend them to a mental health professional that works with them and that would be able to provide family therapy because it's something that they kind of all experience together, and that can benefit them. And obviously, the situation is going to be different with different people, right? There's individual therapy, group therapy, family therapy. It all depends on the situation and what happens. So, specifically with this family, since this is something that happened to them as a group and they all saw this experience happen to them at that same moment, this is something that like family therapy that can really help them kind of cope with this together, understand each other's emotions. The parents are able to understand their child's emotions, and just talking things through the kids with the parents is also something that's very beneficial. Just being open and discussing your thoughts and feelings can really help process those emotions, right? So yeah, that's something that came to mind that I just wanted to share, relevant to PTSD. And another criteria from the DSM-5 is persistent avoidance of anything associated with the traumatic events, such as avoiding certain people, places, even objects, because depending on what the traumatic event or events was, you might want to avoid maybe the person that hurt you, right? The person that caused you that trauma, whether it's a family member, maybe the family says, "Oh, we're gonna go to your uncle's house," and your uncle was the one that caused that trauma. You might want to say, "Oh, I don't feel well. I don't really feel like going. Can I stay home?" So things like that, like noticing things like that, where it's all of a sudden, right? Because let's say, for an example, if you notice your child used to be close with your uncle, or with their uncle, and then all of a sudden they say, "Oh, I don't want to go to their house anymore," or "Oh, can I just stay home?" or "I'm not feeling well, I'm feeling a little sick," and that's become like a constant thing every time you bring up that uncle's house, then that could be a possible sign that something might have happened there. So just kind of being aware of those signs, right? Another thing is also just kind of in that same thing, trying to avoid related memories, thoughts, or feelings. Maybe if you're hanging out with friends or family and you get a certain maybe upset feeling, that can kind of trigger you to think of the last time you were upset, right? So especially if that was something that happened recently, or immediately after, and you have that same upset feeling or angry feeling, it can bring you back to that moment, right? So that is something that can also trigger people, along with, like I said, the people, places, and objects, right? That people might want to avoid that remind them of that traumatic event. And then another thing is also just noticing changes in mood, behavior, such as maybe progressive low self-esteem. You notice that this person used to have better self-esteem about themselves, maybe something happened that triggered that, and they no longer feel as confident as they used to feel. And this can also be something that happens over time. It might not be like a switch, but it can start to happen over time. So that's something to pay attention to as well, right? Just noticing the behaviors and the patterns that they used to have and how that's changed. So also just thinking about, with this case specifically, low self-esteem, like I said, lack of interest in activities, so they might not feel as interested in doing the things that they used to like, or the things that they used to enjoy. Maybe they used to enjoy playing sports or playing music and going out with their friends, but now all of a sudden they don't want to do those things anymore. They feel more closed off. They might feel isolated because they feel like they can't talk to anybody about it, or they might be scared to talk to somebody about it, so they start to push people away, go outside less, and things like that. Also, something that they mentioned is, I believe it's a type of amnesia. It's called dissociative amnesia. So, dissociative amnesia related to PTSD could be, as an example, maybe you're talking to your friend or maybe a therapist about the traumatic event that happened, and you're having trouble remembering what happened in that moment. And it has to do specifically with the traumatic event, and it could be your brain trying to protect you. This can also go into other disorders, such as DID, dissociative identity disorder. This is something that can happen with that. I won't get too much into that, but this is something that kind of goes along with trauma, right? This, I believe it was dissociative amnesia. So it's kind of your brain trying to get you to forget about that traumatic event in a way to protect you so that you don't constantly think about that event. But then in a way, it harms you because then you're not able to fully process the event that happened to you. And especially if you have trouble remembering what happened, the details of what happened, especially if it was something that involves children or minors, being involved with adults, because children can experience trauma as well. Especially if it was adult inflicting it, and maybe, it can affect anyone at any age, basically. And especially as you get older too, those traumatic events, they might still be forgotten in your mind. So yeah, thinking about things like that. And another criteria they mentioned was heightened reactions such as irritability and angry outbursts, even things like getting startled more easily. It takes very little things to happen for somebody to get upset very easily, right? So maybe somebody spilled a glass of water and it touched their arm or it touched their shoes, and they get very upset over that when something like that used to not bother them before, right? So kind of noticing those patterns in somebody that is very important, just so that you're able to see like, hey, like, this used to not bother you as much. You used to be less irritable, you know, or more chill, using words like that. You know your friends or your family members more than a stranger would, so their patterns of behavior a little bit better. And so just kind of noticing things like that, and also, like I said, getting startled more easily. And this can apply, like I said, to children as well. So if you notice maybe someone slams a door or closes a door, and maybe a slightly loud noise, fireworks, possibly, that kind of stuff that can easily trigger somebody, maybe when it used to not trigger them before, right? So that's probably because they experienced something traumatic and those sounds easily startled them, right? And yeah, so then also things like having trouble concentrating, as well as reckless or self-destructive behaviors. Maybe they're starting to use substances more than they used to, or they picked up a new substance that they've never used before, alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, things like that. And you kind of notice an increase in those patterns or behaviors, and that can be a sign of something as well, right? So yeah, those were a few of the criteria mentioned by the DSM-5. So obviously, if you are more interested in like that thorough explanation of the DSM-5, you can easily look that up online. They have, I found the resources through the NIH, and you can find that through Google. Yeah. So I think it's really cool, really important, especially if you're interested in the mental health space as a professional, future professional, student. I think it's really interesting and really cool. So feel free to look up those resources. And yeah, they can be really helpful for things like this, in cases like this, right? Especially if you're already working with clients that might deal with PTSD. So like I mentioned, C-PTSD is not in the DSM-5, but it does share a lot of similar symptoms to PTSD. So that is something that you can look into as well. C-PTSD has to do more with experiencing prolonged periods of trauma. So this can be, it's more with if you see something every day, right? If you're experiencing or even witnessing violence very often, it doesn't even have to be every day, but maybe just consistently, right? So that's kind of more about C-PTSD. It is a newer thing that they found. So it hasn't been included in the DSM-5 yet, but yeah, it's very interesting. So if you're interested, please look into that as well. But yeah, just some, quick statistics is according to the National Center for PTSD, about 6 in 100 people in the U.S. develop PTSD in their lifetime. They also said that women are more likely to experience PTSD in their lifetime more than men. For women, it's about 8%, and for men, it's about 4%. And I thought that was very interesting. They also did mention veterans and how veterans are more likely to experience PTSD over normal civilians, normal citizens. So, I mean, that kind of is very self-explanatory, right? You're in conditions that require you to potentially, put yourself at risk a lot more often and more frequently than the normal civilian. You experience and you witness more trauma, especially if you're in other countries, especially, back then with World War I, World War II, being sent out to other countries and, witnessing death, injuries, things like that can be very traumatic. And yeah, so that's some of the statistics I wanted to mention. And just briefly talk about things that can be done, right? We can do a lot self-care wise, but it's very important that if you think you know somebody or if you believe that you have PTSD, you reach out to a mental health care professional, a therapist, a psychiatrist, and get that diagnosis, right? Because that's the first step. So once you get that step, you're able to work with a therapist that has specialized techniques that can help you get through that trauma and process that trauma, right? And it's not to say that, oh, you're going to be cured, because with mental illness, that's something that you live with, but it's something that you can manage and you can live with in a healthy way, right? Especially with a therapist, you learn new techniques and ways to de-escalate yourself. And yeah, so just kind of learning stress management techniques, things like that. So definitely, if you're interested in that, please look up NAMI, NAMI. They have a lot of great mental health care resources. If you're unable to find one for yourself, of course, obviously reach out to, I would recommend us, if you're in our area, Chicago Area Project, for referrals. We can refer you to a local mental health care provider near you where you're able to get those resources. Or if you know any local nonprofits near you that are able to give you those referrals, feel free and reach out, right? And especially, like I said, if you know somebody going through this, have a chat with them, ask them, what's going on, obviously without forcing them to talk about it, because that's the last thing that you want to do is force somebody to talk about their trauma, especially if they're not ready to do that yet. So just kind of letting them know that you're there for them and that you'll be that safe space that they need, right? Whenever they're ready. So yeah, other things that you can do in your day-to-day, just kind of connecting with people that you trust, making sure you avoid alcohol or drugs if possible, just because those substances can worsen your symptoms. And obviously, that's not what we want for you. And also, exercising regularly is something that can help. Being outside more, just kind of being around nature, just being around people, something that can kind of ease your mind and relax you. And like I said, learning stress management techniques such as breathing techniques. There's a lot of easy breathing techniques you can also learn online. There is something called box breathing, which I would recommend people look up if that is something that you are interested in. Also meditating, that is also in that realm of breathing techniques. But yeah, those are a couple examples. If you, are interested, feel free. YouTube has a lot of great things like that too, so I do recommend that. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me talk about PTSD. I hope you all were able to learn something from this, and have a great rest of your evening. I will see you all later. Take care. Bye.